It was a laid-back Sunday afternoon, the kind when you go grocery shopping and never imagined that it would forever alter my life. I just finished cutting the lawn and was getting ready for the game, so don't anticipate anything spectacular to happen. We ran out of milk, so I quickly grabbed my keys and took my normal route to the shop and parked in my typical position, which was standard back then. Everything broke when I heard her wheeling my basket down the dairy aisle in search of the lowest brand. I could hear that high, gentle laugh that used to be any place, Rachel, reserved just for me. At first, I thought maybe she left work early because it was coming from the front of the store. Although it wouldn't be the first time, my stomach tightened into a knot as I turned the corner. She wasn't by herself there. She had a cart fuller than normal when she stood by the checkout, but I was frozen in place by a man I had never seen before, who was standing next to her and laughing with her. Then the actual gut strike, with a girl and a boy clinging to her as if she was their mother, and I clutched the cart handle so firmly that my knuckles went white while my brain frantically tried to make sense of it. Perhaps she was assisting, a friend with childcare. Perhaps there was a plausible explanation. And then I noticed that she leaned in and gave the man a gentle, well-known kiss, the kind a wife provides her husband, not a friend or a colleague. At that point, I felt the blood drain from my body as the young girl tugged on Rachel's arm and whimpered, "Mom, can we get ice cream too?" My head began to spin, and all of a sudden, the store felt overly light. My wife, loud Mother Rachel, simply ruffled her hair and grinned down at the youngster. I realized then that this wasn't a mistake. Rather, it was her actual life, and I was the idiot who didn't know. I made myself take a step back into the shadows and stabilize myself by holding onto the edge of a display stand. My thoughts were a storm of ideas. How long has she been living two lives? Who is he? I saw them complete Greg's checkout since the cashier called him that, and he laughed as Rachel kissed him on the cheek as if it were the most normal thing in the world after he gave her his back. Rachel had been adept at making me feel like an afterthought during the past year, and now she sat in my chest like a scorching coal. She had become aloof, working late and returning home weary and smelling different. I attributed this type of weariness to stress from a marriage that I never would have thought possible. I watched her and her family from a distance as they went outside. Rage, amazement, and something else I haven't yet identified caused my hands to shake. My breathing slowed as I watched them put goods into a gray vehicle outside. I was now in observation mode. The license plate, 2 booster seats in the back, the glove compartment, not registered to me. I took out my phone and took pictures. Not for legal purposes. No, not just yet. I needed evidence that Rachel had been dividing her time. Greg is the icing on the cake between me and this man who plays house with me and then plays mother and wife with someone else. I knew how to tell since Rachel stated, "I'll be back," as she gave him a final hug. She advised me last weekend not to let the kids miss me too much following my work trip. I inhaled deeply after she left town because my heart was pounding in my ears. Then Greg's final words were, "Don't worry, baby. Let the loser pay the bills. While we enjoy life." As the loser, I gritted my teeth, stuffed my phone back in my pocket, and turned away. I could have walked straight up to them, confronted them, and caused a commotion in front of the entire parking lot. However, it wasn't my way. Greg believed he was safe, and Rachel believed she was intelligent, but they didn't know what I was already thinking. The kind of retaliation that would make them both regret it. As I made my way to my car, Rachel had stolen years of my life, and Greg had laughed at me for being such an idiot. It was my turn now, and I was determined to ensure that Greg never laughed again. I can hardly recall the anger rising as I drove home, but underneath there was a cold calculation that was sharper. I wouldn't be foolish enough to lash out blindly because Rachel had spent years plotting. Even though she had duped me, I had to comprehend this complex web of lies if I sought retribution. Every danger of it first. So I dug and spent the following 3 nights discovering the truth while confined to my house. Workplace with just a whiskey bottle, a laptop, and the nagging suspicion that the lady I loved had been deceiving me. Greg wasn't just some affair. He was her second husband, officially wed with the same vows, and we had been together for more than 10 years. I discovered their 10-year-old marriage certificate in a separate city, which meant that she was already married when she walked down the aisle with me. I looked through financial statements. Rachel, trying to balance 2 guys, 2 homes, and 2 lifestyles, had been transferring little sums of money, 50 here, 100 there, from our joint accounts into a different one. But as the years went by, the withdrawals increased by thousands of dollars at one point. Greg had been taking lavish vacations every few months on my cash. He had been hurting my back by paying the mortgage. Rachel used those months as a justification to travel for work. But she was actually spending those playing house on the weekends with Greg and their 2 kids, the first of whom was born 8 years ago, which means that while Rachel was still sleeping in my bed, she became pregnant with Greg's child. Greg knew the worst. In part, Greg wasn't a helpless fool or a poor, ignorant boyfriend. He had known about me since day one, even though Rachel had been keeping me in the dark. I discovered their text conversations in Rachel's drafts, emails she never sent. Those communications told me everything. Tom still believes He's such a fool. You spend too much time there. I'm working this weekend. While we enjoy life, the loser pays the bills. I look forward to the day when I won't have to see his pitiful face again. Loser. Pitiful. Once more, I clutched the whiskey glass so firmly that I believed it would crack. Greg laughed at me because he knew that Rachel hadn't just cheated. She forced me to pay for it. For Greg, and she had created a whole second family. They embraced the fact that they had conned me jointly. But the problem with flawless frauds is that they never last forever, and those who constructed them suffer the most when they crumble. I wasn't going to be some foolish spouse who flung things in a rage. No. Rachel and Greg had been plotting for years, believing they were having a tantrum. I contacted the bank first. I froze everything, because I was going to prove to them how foolish they were. Greg sought the help of several folks who learned their lessons the easy way. Rachel might rot in the grave because I didn't want him to suffer the hard way. I wanted him to understand why. Greg, on the other hand, needed to bleed. Following her own collapse, I spent the following few days ensuring Greg was secure because I knew Rachel had rushed to him as soon as I ejected her. Greg was all she had left, ironically, because she had no money, assets, or anything else. He loved to be in charge and had spent years thinking he was better than me since he knew my wife was sneaking into his bed. His conceit would now be his undoing. I texted him to talk, but it took him a few minutes to tell Greg what I'd done. Rachel was gone, and then 3 dots started typing. Greg finally met me at Donovan at 1 p.m. I had no intention of going to that bar, but Greg would find me there. I grinned perfectly. Earlier that day, I made a completely different call, the kind that doesn't go via official channels. Before I was even aware of Rachel's other existence, I met a man named Lucas in a poker game months earlier. He wasn't a decent man, but he was helpful. He dealt with issues, and Greg was an issue. So, I informed him what I wanted to do, which was to cause Greg to suffer and shatter his ribs and hands. But above all, make sure Lucas never touches a lady again. After a few moments of silence, he stated, "That will cost extra. Worth every penny." We prepared the facts. Greg was walking when he thought he was meeting me. According to the bartender, Greg had just placed his normal drink order when 2 men entered his worst nightmare. He had little time to react as they came up to him. Before one of them snatched him by the collar and jerked him out of his chair, they pulled him outside into an alley. After the first blow broke 3 of his ribs and the second almost smashed his nose, the true lesson started. They didn't have to murder him, and by the time they were finished, Greg would have preferred to die. At 2 in the morning, when Rachel called, I let it ring. When I eventually picked up Tom, Greg was crying and in a panic. My goodness! Desperate, I grinned and told Rachel to calm down. What's wrong? Someone attacked Greg. He's in the hospital. I took my time answering. Damn, that's harsh. Silence. You did this. I let the allegation hang and then gave a trembling breath. The last blow I gave you was that Rachel's actions would have an impact on her. No, Rachel, you ruined him. I sat back in my chair. Greg chose the wrong man to betray. According to the official hospital report, the harm would be irreparable. His hands might ultimately recover, but what the doctor said next, Greg would never touch another woman again, just as he had ridiculed me for years for stealing what wasn't rightfully mine. Now he had nothing left. After that night, Rachel didn't call again, but she didn't have to. Because I knew she was sitting in the hospital, gazing at the shattered man she had chosen over me. She had given up everything for him, and now that he was useless to her, Rachel had nothing left. Rachel had pursued power for 10 years until, ultimately, she had nothing. A week later, I texted Rachel one final time. No description, no words, simply a photo of me grinning while perched on my couch, with another woman next to me holding Rachel's old wedding band in her hand. She never answered, because she didn't have to. She now understood how it felt to lose, and I learned a lesson that some men found simple. Revenge is about taking everything, not just getting even. And I did just that. The stillness was deafening. I pictured Rachel sitting in the hospital, staring at Greg. She had laughed at me for years, but now she was just a crying, broken mess. The following morning, she stopped laughing, and I carried on with my day as though nothing had happened. I prepared my coffee, checked my emails, and took my time eating breakfast. No rush, because at 10 a.m. she eventually gave another call. Her voice sounded strained, full of anxiety and despair. "Tom, I need to see you." I grinned. "Why?" "Greg, we need to talk." As though we were still a team, as though she hadn't betrayed me for 10 years. "Tom, please stop screwing me over," I murmured, swirling my coffee. "I don't think we have anything left to talk about, Rachel. You ought to be with Greg right now. He needs you." "But he doesn't, does he?" She broke then. "Bastard," she spat. The instant I said those words, her voice broke. She was afraid as well as angry because for the first time she truly understood who she had been dealing with. Rachel must have believed she could undo what had happened, as if I would somehow take everything back. She sobbed, she begged, she pleaded. At midday, when she was at my door, I let her in simply for fun. She barged in, a shell of the woman I once knew, wild-eyed and shaking. She screamed, "What the hell did you do to Greg?" I sipped my coffee. "Greg had an accident." She clenched her teeth. "Cut the shit, Tom. This wasn't random." I shrugged. "That sounds like a Greg issue." She slammed her fist on the table. "You ruined him." And that was the realization. Damn you. She had spent 10 years believing she could control me, but the instant she realized there was no way out, she was lost. She was weak. "How could you do this?" she muttered. I stepped closer and watched her trembling. Her lip quivered. So I allowed the silence to stretch, and then I struck the last blow. "The nicest part, Rachel, is that Greg is finished. He's no longer a man. You wasted 10 years following him, and now you have nothing." Tears filled her eyes. She shook her head. "You can't just get away with this. I'll go to the police." I reached into my desk drawer and took out a folder. She blinked. Bank statements, emails, screenshots, proof. Rachel's face contorted in fear as she read Greg's texts, laughing about conning me. "Where did you get this?" she muttered. I leaned back. "Doesn't matter." She turned pale. "If you go to the police, I'll make sure they see this first." And she knew it. Rachel was trembling. She had spent so much time playing games, believing she was untouchable. Now, She was standing in the ruins of her own decisions. "You're a monster," she whispered. I grinned. "No, Rachel, I just finally followed your rules." And she had nothing left.